So today is an exciting day. It's the last day of the group work for once, but we also have before two lectures. And we're going to start with Valentina Bosetti. Yes, we can talk about game theory and IEMs. And yeah, we had this rule that usually we have 1 minute on presentation of yourself, maybe your past, some interesting career insights to share, and maybe just to give an introduction. Exactly. And then
So the most interesting thing to share is that if you ask Francesco how long it takes to go up there, okay, don't trust whatever he says. It takes 4 times longer. So consider that when you want to go up. So yes, I'm Valentina. I started to do integrated assessment modeling with game theory. That's how I got in love with the whole thing. So that's why I tell you that story, because that's the story that I love the most. It made me think that these are very incredibly useful, though most of the time wrong, instruments, and they're fun to play with. So I'll try to be to give you some insights so that then we can share some code with you. It's very old, so it's vintage. DICE 2013 North and South, but it's what you need to understand how you build cooperation or mesh solution in your code, and then you can scale it up and do whatever. I'll also show you results of the RISE 55 regions, and you can do it with any model basically. So it's not moving anymore, obviously. And Johannes will say, I told you so. Because it's not the, okay. So the reason why one wants to play with game theory is that there is a lot of heterogeneity. I'll show you some of this heterogeneity in a second. And yet we need all the countries to cooperate, but we don't have any international police to enforce an agreement. So we need to study incentives because we need cooperation across regions, but we have heterogeneity, and we do not know how to enforce this cooperation. And most models we run, most runs we do, either we assume countries are going on their own, no cooperation whatsoever, or we assume some form of cooperation on the climate imposed by God or the UN or whatever you want, but we impose this constraint that then we as modelers decide how to impose on countries, different ways of sharing the effort, but we never take into consideration what would be the incentives, what is, how likely it is that a country might accept that, or maybe we do in some ex post evaluation. But what I want to talk about today is how models can be used to study the incentives to do that, to do what we enforce on them, to be in a coalition. And then typically we study coalition on climate, but you could think, and actually people have thought about coalition on climate and trade. And this is the policy that we are implementing next year in Europe, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So you could think of having a coalition on climate policy and technology. So you could play with your model and have coalition formed on various elements that are, that connect countries. And we're going to see how you can do that. So today it's a primer on that. To convince you that there is heterogeneity, this is, you know that climate damages are very heterogeneous. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But there's also ability to pay. This is the distribution of gross median household income in dollars and PPP. And you see, obviously, the huge heterogeneity that represents heterogeneity in ability to pay for mitigation. But also there's a different potential, very heterogeneous potential for solar power, for example. And there's very different potential for ability to innovate, or actually already the stock of patents is very, very heterogeneous across countries. And we could go on and on. We could look at the rare materials map. We could look at the, already prepared capacity to build new wires for underwater cables, et cetera, et cetera. Very heterogeneous. And this is what the climate policies we have already seen in the world, and again, huge heterogeneity. So that's what game theory can help us study. And in history, it has done it in 3 ways. I think there are 3 streams of research. We're going to go through all 3 streams because I think it's because I made the connection in my mind, that maybe you already made it, the connection in your mind, but it's always used to make sure that we all made that same connection. The first stream of literature is a theory stream of literature. It's not really theory like Nash writing his paper, though there's also that in the back, but it's people applying game theory to international environmental agreements in a very, theoretical form, and understanding lessons from that kind of very simple model. Then there is experimental work in the lab that really tried to look at what people do, whether they cooperate or not, and assume that these people each represent a country. For example, what can we learn from that? And then there's the work that some of us, most of us will do and has done, which is to take a numerically calibrated model, let's call it a YAM, integrated assessment model, and play with game theory. So this is what I want to cover today, and then we'll start to play with the last one. Okay, so the basic idea of game theory is that of studying the strategic decision making across players when you have multiple players and you have a situation in which they influence each other. Typically, you do that with a public good, and this is the most fun picture. It makes me always laugh, because when you talk about public good, you always have in mind something like the sun, the air, but it really depends on the context. If you think that in China, they're privatizing good air by creating balloons so that kids of rich family can play soccer without having air pollution, you can immediately see that the concept of what is a public good, a club good, a shared common, are all changing depending on the technologies we have. So in this case, even the sun can become something that is not a public good anymore because it is rival. Okay. So in general, however, game theory makes sense when you have a lot of these public goods. And the players of the game typically can be countries, so representative of a government, at international negotiations, but, and I think this is where most of the future research is going to be, players can also be stakeholders, representing some interest. It could be, the incumbent, the lobby of the incumbent technology. It could be the concerned citizens group. Okay, so players could be groups, and they could be countries, as in most traditional, or it could be groups within countries or across countries that are not necessarily at the level of the government. Strategies may include in this, yes? So air pollution is the traditional public good that, you use in every class example of what a public good is, because it cannot be excluded. So air we breathe is shared, rich and poor, whomever, whatever we put in the air, we breathe it all. Actually, in China, with this idea of these balloons to play soccer with big filters, they sort of create air that is now excludable. So others can be excluded to breathe that good air. The poor kids, they play in the air the others are breathing. The rich kids, they play within this balloon with filtered air. So it's not a public good anymore. It's like a big dome that we sometimes have to play tennis in the winter just to heat up the air. So just to give a sense of the fact that what is a public good changes and will keep changing. So strategies. The typical strategy, what you see in the North-South model, is abatement strategy. So what are the emissions? But you could think of many other strategies. What they have been thinking recently is the strategy to trade with another country. You could think of a strategy that is to develop a clean technology to share that clean technology. Strategy can be any action, and it can be static or it can be a dynamic action. Typically, when we think of emission profile, we think of a path of emissions. And payoff, I think, is the most interesting. So the traditional game theories would tell you that payoff is welfare, that is basically some sort of discounted consumption. And it's okay, that's what we'll play with today. But if you're intrigued by moving forward in the type of objective that a country might have, you can put in the payoff whatever you want. You can have, the payoff of a country is the inequality in that country that needs to be, so the inverse of the inequality, and the welfare plus some level of biodiversity. So you can have much more complex payoffs than we typically have in the studies we've done so far. And so what you study is how, the incentives countries have and how their choices are influenced by the benefits and cost of their action and other action. Actual benefits and costs and perceived benefits and costs. So here I want to tell you something very interesting. More recently, we've seen many applications of artificial intelligence everywhere popping up. And, most of these applications, when they want to mimic the behavior of people, they're using this model, they're using a game theoretical setting. Basically, they're mimicking an individual who's reacting with some objective function that is influenced by some global variables that the individual has no control on. And he or she is reacting to this information. So soon enough, there will be some engine that countries going to negotiations will create to understand what is their optimal strategy. I mean, at least to ask the algorithm, what should be the optimal strategy of my country? And they're going to be based on something like a version, complex version, different version, maybe secret version, because they're going to have their own, modelers, their own data, etc., of what is the best strategy to play. And so it will be, most of the information is going to come from stuff that we do that hopefully will always remain open source. And it's very important that we do this research, because some of this stuff instead will become, copyrighted by some people, and some governments will have better algorithms in understanding both what they are, their benefits and their perceived benefits by the populations, etc. So strategies are, the ensemble of the decision that various countries agree upon, and the equilibrium can be reached when there is some mutually beneficial outcome. We're going to define that more precisely, because there are various ideas of the stability of a coalition or grand coalition or sub-coalition. And then we will be able to look into the free rider problem. So the fact that countries might avoid acting, hoping that others will act in their place, the prisoner dilemma. Tit for tat is very interesting, because this is something that you can only mimic if you have a dynamic ability to remodulate your game. So I play a certain strategy, we meet next year at the COP, we do the stock taking, we see that you're actually not doing anything, and then we reciprocate in one way that is negative. If we see that you're actually avoiding deforestation, reducing deforestation, we act in some other ways. These are all dynamics elements of a strategy that are very relevant for negotiations. And then coalition building is also something that you can study. So what we really want to study, and I'll show you in a second, is understanding the incentives. So we, as I said before, what we do is we enforce carbon emissions, we enforce constraints on countries. Instead, here we want to understand what are the incentives and the payoffs of countries to be in or out that constraint. Henceforth, we can better help building coalition or allowing for some self-enforcing agreement to happen that is not necessarily shallow like some of the self-enforcing agreements we've seen so far. So, given that you're all coming from different backgrounds, so the most simple game is that sort of mimic what the game we will do in a second, is a game where I have two countries. They're symmetric, identical. That's where we start from. We can call them south or north, but they are identical. They have some cost of abatement. They have some benefits from abatement. And then you can build a biometrics game like this, where you basically have that if both pollutes, say they both receive 0, this is obviously the socially optimum equilibria, but then for each country, there is an incentives to deviate, because if we're both abating, we get 3-3. But if you keep abating and I deviate, I get 5 because I'm not paying the cost of abatement and you're paying it all your own. Now, an important element of an important element is the following. We are assuming that this situation is actually possible. We will see that in some stability concept, we will presume always that if anybody depart from this situation, we go here directly. So what that means is that it could be that we are both abating, and that you don't, instead you go home and you don't do your homework, you don't abate, and I'm benefiting from I'm paying the cost and I'm decreasing emissions, and you're benefiting from it, and I'm stupid there and just getting the -2, and you're enjoying your +5. That doesn't happen in reality when you have government, okay? Because you go home, you're not abating, and I immediately see it through multiple instruments, okay? I immediately see that you're still cutting your forest, etc. So what happens then, very likely, is that everything unravels. And I also deviate, okay? So that this equilibrium, this possibility doesn't actually exist in reality. So depending on the technology, it could be that the possibility of playing this game is so remote that then I realize that I have to play this game. So the technology affects how likely it is that we deviate and fall back in the 0-0 case. And these technologies are the ones that if you look at the history of negotiations, what, for example, the US was always asking is the ability to monitor, the ability. So that's why we want to have imaging from satellites to tell us whether the forest is there or not, and all these technologies, because technology changed the possibility to fall in the defecting dominant strategy. Okay, where you go home and you don't do, and you hope to be there enjoying the other's effort. So technology will tell us how likely it is that various strategies will be played, and technology will also help us in understanding, what kind of stability concept we then want to apply. Sorry. Okay, so we call the Nash equilibrium the pollute-pollute, just to make sure we are on the same page. We call the full cooperative outcome the abate. Okay, in the full cooperative outcome, we basically are deciding to take both payoff into account, and we want to do the best in that sense, mimicking the sum of the payoff of the two and maximizing that. Okay, so let me start from the early work that was mostly theory-oriented and looked into international environmental agreements. At the beginning, they also had in mind agreements about CFC, etc. Then it all boiled down to climate change. Sorry. So these were papers studying the interaction among countries they mostly thought of countries as very simple, homogeneous players with costs and benefits that were the same. Remember the first few slides I showed you? Obviously, this is a highly far from reality, but this is when you have to solve with paper and pen, that's how you have to start. Then only they started to move out from this assumption of very few simply symmetric players. And they did play with two concepts. The first type of models were cooperative models. So they assumed cooperation. That means if somebody defects, he's gonna pay a penalty. Okay, so let's assume we have 3 players here. Let's assume that the 3 players are China, the US, and Italy. Okay, and we are expected to cooperate. Okay, now let's assume that one of the 3 players deviates. Let's say Italy. Okay, big incentives because these 2 big countries will do a lot of their effort. They're spending all this money, and maybe I'll do something tomorrow, so I deviate from this coalition. Now, what happens, for example, in the gamma core concept, or in all these assumed cooperative models, is that the other 2, China and US, stop doing anything. They keep burning their fossil fuels and they do nothing. So to calculate whether I have an incentive, Italy has an incentive to deviate, I have to compare 2 things. The payoff Italy has when playing within the coalition, China, Italy, USA, and the payoff Italy has in the Nash situation where everybody is going on their own. Okay, and Italy getting a lot of damages from climate change will most likely be willing to stay in the coalition because in this instance, I'm assuming that the stability, I'm calculating stability as the difference between the payoff I get within the coalition and the payoff I get in the Nash, if everything unravels. Okay, so this is the first type of literature that is out there, but most people said, okay, that's not the way it works. That's too easy to maintain a coalition because you know, if the counterfactual is everything unravels, obviously country will find a way to cooperate. So the most of the literature has developed non-cooperative models. Okay, this is where most of the paper has been written. Non-cooperative models assume that non-cooperation is what happens. So there's no police that will have a lot of punishment for you to get out, etc. So we start from non-cooperation. And what we do, we calculate the stability of a coalition. Let's go back to the example, Italy, US, and China. And so what we will compare to calculate whether this coalition is stable for Italy, we will calculate the payoff in Italy for Italy in the coalition. And then we will assume that China and USA are doing their business and Italy deviates alone. The payoff that Italy gets then is obviously very good. They're not paying any abatement costs and they're benefiting from the effort of China and the US. You see, this is a much more stringent or much harder to beat in terms of payoff, no? The payoffs of deviating from the coalition. If you use this concept, then the stability of the coalition becomes much harder because each player, if you calculate for each player how much they gain outside the coalition if the others keep working, then you need to create a lot of welfare in the coalition to convince everybody to be in. So the internal external stability is this. You calculate what do I get if I get out and the others keep working? Well, what do I get if I get in? Which one of the two is larger? If the one when I'm out is larger, then the coalition is not stable for Italy. Okay. Now, can the coalition be potentially internally stable? That's a further step, which is a sort of like potentially Pareto. Okay. So do I have enough? Do I generate enough wealth if we put together everybody to potentially compensate everybody from deviating? It could be that everybody is better off outside, but together we generate so much wealth that we can compensate everybody from deviating. So internal, external stability plus potential stability are the concept that these guys in this literature have applied to the climate problem. I hope that so this literature basically is the optimistic literature. Tolkien's and others, they basically assume that if you deviate, everything unravels, and it's much easier than to think that the coalition is stable, because you are comparing what you get in the coalition with what you get in the Nash. Many coalitions then are stable. If you use this concept, then it's much harder to get a stable coalition. And these guys were mostly right. I mean, what happens in real life represents that the pessimistic people were more near to the reality of what's going on. Any question about this? Yes. I give him mine.
So are these two kind of models looks different, or only like you have showed us a simple diagram with the payoffs of two players? My question would be, does that mean if we change the payoffs in the diagram you showed us, a model can turn from a cooperative model to non-cooperative model, or they have different forms?
Okay, that's a very good question. In reality, you calculate stability ex post. So you can use your model, you build your model, you calculate all the payoffs that you have in the various coalition or with the Nash, and then with the deviation of each country from the coalition. And then you can apply both concept of, they're called models, but you can apply both concept of stability to your data. So you can have your own model, you generate, you do this ex post, basically, with integrated assessment model, you generate the payoffs, and then ex post, if you want, with the R script, you take all the payoffs for all the regions in the various runs and do the comparison. So there's not, you don't need to run two different models. You do need to run various runs with various level of cooperation.
Okay. Cooperative. So it's so what determines that I am in a cooperative model and non-cooperative model is that the options that countries or players or strategies they are allowed to have are different. For example, in a cooperative model, they are either corporate or not. So
Nash.
it's about the strategy that players are allowed to have are different in this kind of models.
To calculate the stability of every coalition, with this concept, what you do is you run each coalition and compare the payoffs to the Nash of the players. To calculate stability ex post with this type of concept, you have to calculate, you have to run every coalition and then all the runs when each and every country is deviating, but the others keep cooperating. So the model is the same, you just have to do different runs and ex post compare different things. And you need much less runs here because you're always comparing whatever payoff in the coalition or the sub-coalition with the Nash. Here you have all these USA deviate, China deviate, etc. And so that you can calculate the payoff of each and every country deviating from each and every coalition. Now, Nico?
Yeah, thank you very much. The barriers to entry are, I mean, the barrier to exit in the cooperative model is when you anticipate them, a barrier to entry. So isn't it less likely that this cooperative coalition that you described will ever come to pass, because everybody is afraid, oh, once I'm in, I cannot get out?
But it's not that once you're in, the only thing that happens if you get out is that there's no, everything unravels, especially with the gamma core. So once you're in, if you get out, you know, and everybody's going to go out from the agreement. That's why it's more optimistic, because you know, the weight of deviating, the cost of deviating is enormous.
Yeah. And exactly this might be the reason never to enter.
Oh yes,
not to check in to
you
this
can say
coalition.
nobody would ever sign in the first place. Yes, but say yes, that's true. But say if you assume that there is enough happiness generated from cooperation, then and especially if you know, the way Eric Talkens thinks is really that that's the model. I mean, that's the way we are doing it. We created the UNFCCC because that's what we want to do. We want to cooperate on solving the problem. And so he's sort of morally, he thinks we have abstained. We already generated, showed a position that is willing to cooperate. I don't think there's, I'm with you. I don't think there's any way this model really mimics reality, in the sense that even I talked to you about the gamma core, but there are other ways you can impose the cooperative or study the cooperative models with other type of punishments when upon deviation, that are not the unraveling of the Nash, but other form of punishment that are totally unrealistic. The only thing that is similar to that kind of punishment is the idea of the clubs and the trade punishment, which we will see in a bit. Okay, so yeah, just to say that this is where we stand when this is the literature that I cover with these few bullet points of what we learned from this work. So what we learned from this work is that stable coalitions tend to be small. And if they're large, they're shallow. That means that if they cover multiple countries, these multiple countries won't do much abatement. And this is where, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, people were saying, yeah, you see, people meaning the game theorists were saying, yeah, our theory, you don't need a genius to say that, but they were running a lot of their models, and they thought they were proved right by the Kyoto Protocol. Second is that if you start to have ancillary benefits or some form of punishment, you might do better than that. So what do I mean with ancillary benefits? You could have technological shared technologies across the members of the coalitions. There's a paper we did with Enrique on that. You could have you could think of storing among members of the coalition. You could think of keeping the fossil fuel on the ground and punishing the others with higher prices of fossil, which then will lead to lower emissions. So you could think of various interesting ideas within the coalition. And then there's all the transfers. Now, transfers are born only if you include heterogeneity. Okay, so few papers have started to include heterogeneity in this very theoretical simple model, meaning heterogeneous damages or heterogeneous mitigation costs, and then they study the transfers within the coalition. Okay, so if we make a coalition and I use a set of weights in the coalition whereby the coalition is made by US and China, and there are huge transfer from the US to China, then it's more likely that China's payoff within the coalition is such that China will not deviate. Now, the problem with some of these, we're going to see them, some similar results with numerically calibrated model are politically implausible transfer. So you can not actually imagine that that can happen in reality. Then there's a big literature going crazy about uncertainty. If you are into uncertainty, this is your field, because when you play game theory with uncertainty, magic stuff happens, it becomes very complicated. So if you like that, I mean, this, you can have a lot of fun. And there's people having fun also with this very theoretical models showing how much it matters, uncertainty. And then, and this is the point where I want you to feel, you know, I'm poking, you really need to look into these negative emissions in geoengineering, which are sort of things we were not thinking, where most of the literature came out, do matter, may shift incentives, might change everything on the level of the stability of a coalition. And people didn't study this at all. In theory terms, zero. I'll show you some paper on the experimental literature, and zero with YAMS, really, literally. So you can think of coalition of people with a lot of storage space underground. Or you could think of how geoengineering can basically screw up a lot of the possible coalitions. So this is something that this is gonna produce potentially your Nature climate paper. So experimental work in the lab. I know you don't care, you don't give a damn, but it's important always when you have a model to test it on reality. So I'm not showing you this, but experiments are relevant because actually cooperation is something that we do as humans. We do it as animals. Tonight you watch this video and you kind of enjoyed, not during my class, but it's really enjoyable. You can see how elephants cooperate, monkeys, etc., to do a task. When there is a payoff, animals cooperate. And there is a literature, huge literature, that has studied cooperation, and that finds that a third of the subject are free riders, but 50% are conditional cooperators, which means if you cooperate, I'm going to cooperate. I mean, this is been meta-analysis showing that this happens. So can we find a fair burden sharing agreement to protect the environmental commons? So the literature here is huge. I'm showing you this paper. This paper is looking at a threshold public game, which means we are in the lab. We have to pool our resources. We are endowed with some money. And if we pool our resources, we pay some price, all of us, then we don't cross a threshold, then we don't have some catastrophic climate event. If we don't cross the threshold, then we take the money that we were endowed all on, but there is some probability that we lose everything. And so here is the probability of losing one saving if climate is not protected. So, and this is the groups failing to protect the climate. So if I'm almost sure that 90% of probability that I'm going to lose all my money, what happens is that 50% of groups fail, the other part succeed in protecting the environment. So people participating in their group, they give up their endowment to reach the threshold so that they don't lose everything. But if the probability of losing everything decreases, so it probably is, not, let's say the probability of having the shutdown of the thermal in circulation is very, very far, and I don't trust it, etc. The number of groups failing to protect the climate goes basically up to 100%. So how likely it is that this extreme event happens obviously influences how much I'm willing to cooperate with this threshold public good game. That is one of the ways that climate change has been tested in the lab. Then subsequent work has explored symmetric players. Here players were symmetrics, so poor and rich, how would they share their burden? What is the concept of fairness? You know, again, varying degrees of uncertainty over the climate threshold. Here I have a threshold that is given, and then I have some probability of losing, but it could be the threshold is not known. When the threshold is not known, basically what happens is that you get this. Even if the probability of losing everything is very high, most people do not is not able to converge on the threshold because there is some uncertainty. So there are various situations in which we cannot cooperate when we have situation of uncertainty. So the first group of lessons that we learn from these experiments on international cooperation is that uncertainty matters a lot. The more uncertain, we heard a lot yesterday about how we have to communicate uncertainty wisely. Uncertainty really doesn't help cooperation. It really unravels cooperation. Then there is a lot of problems with the high proposal not guaranteeing high contribution. So you have to have clear pledges, and I think that was heard when they started to do the national determined contribution. Communication, not communication, helps. This happens in the lab, and this is known, and this is why we have rounds and rounds of BESTA and COPs, because people talking to each other cooperate more. And then there's the whole problem of the ethical basis of burden sharing. And you might think this is obvious, but this is what is every COP, the discussion is the fairness based on the fact that we all have a right to develop? Should the fairness concept be every human has the same right to have the same amount of emissions? So this fairness concept, there's no book of God where you open it and you say, okay, this is the fairness concept we should all be using to solve the climate change problem. Everybody has their own perspective. And so this comes out a lot also in the lab. And when you ask the subsequent question, you really see people believing firmly that because they were in doubt less, they should pay less for mitigation. And people believing firmly that it doesn't matter how much you've been in doubt, everybody should contribute the same. And if you do that under the veil of ignorance, they still think these different, they have this different perspective. Then there's a lot of exciting research done on geoengineering, because we know that geoengineering might lead to a problem. There was a beautiful paper by Weitzman showing that there might be a problem with geoengineering leading to sort of a what's called the problem of excessive investment in geoengineering or free driving. And in the lab, we find that. Actually, we find that if we are there, we have different optimal temperature, and we are endowed the possibility of doing geoengineering, what we will do is that we will bring down the temperature. So we will do the maximum geoengineering. The person or the group that has the minimum temperature as the optimal temperature, we push geoengineering. We'll invest in geoengineering too much, and we'll let the others too low temperature. And if you allow people to have counter geoengineering, you end up with the socially optimal temperature, but you spent a lot of money in doing geoengineering, counter geoengineering, engineering, counter geoengineering. So at the end, the people entering the lab, they get out of the lab poorer with the right temperature, but poorer because they spent a lot fighting the geoengineering war one after the other. And treaties might help, but treaties, treaties are very complicated in the presence of geoengineering. So it's not necessarily the case. So we know from experimental literature that geoengineering changes a lot these incentive schemes. We know that from a theoretical perspective, then it would be very nice to see it done on integrated assessment models, where you can actually model the nitty-gritty details of how it works, or the costs, the uncertainty of the costs, etc. Then there's a literature on experimenting with spillovers, where we find that if you have spillovers, meaning that if we group together, we bring down the cost of the clean technology, and that spills to the fringe, to the ones who are not cooperating. So you have a group of or coalition, the coalition brings down the cost, and that spillovers outside. That basically stabilizes, catalyzes cooperation, and makes the fringe reducing their emissions. So the ones who are not in the coalition, obviously, because of the cost of the technology has gone down, they're not going to go and do less emissions themselves, but weakens the incentives to sign the climate club, because you know that if you're outside, you're going to benefit from free, from the lowering of the cost of the clean technology. So you stay out, you let the others do the job. So basically, the idea is that adding R&D to the bargaining table obviously becomes, investment in new technologies, etc., becomes relevant. So we have a bulk of this paper, and at the end there is all the literature, the whole literature in the slides, and there are beautiful reviews that have been done. And I urge you, before starting any experiment on a YAM, to look at both this literature. What have we learned from the theory, and what have we learned when we tested that theory in the lab? Because it always makes sense to base whatever you're working on with a numerical model, which is going to go in various crazy directions that you cannot control, to use these simpler tools to understand why your model is going, maybe to understand why your model is going in weird direction that you didn't expect. And so here is your baby, your numerically calibrated models to do game theory. Okay, what this gives us is the possibility of exploring and enjoying asymmetries across countries. So this is not a problem anymore. I should not worry about all these asymmetries because my model gives it all to me. I can plug in realistic assumption about a lot of other links across countries. For example, there's going to be some level of correlation or relation in the fossil fuel trade sector. There's going to be some correlation across countries to prices of technologies. I don't know what models you prefer at lunch and dinner, but typically the type of or the cost of technology goes down because, say, of learning by doing. That might spread out to other countries, or you might have R&D bringing down the technological costs, and that again might spread out to other countries. So you can have many more links across countries that makes the problem much more interesting. And then the whole dynamic of technical change. In some way, maybe you have a model where this is manna from heaven, fully exogenous, but most models don't. So you're going to have dynamic factors that all these super simple models don't have. And you can play with the other challenges to coordination and cooperation, like negative emissions, geoengineering. So the early literature, the first paper, the first model maybe that was amenable to do this kind of cooperation analysis was RISE. Then there's Carrara and others did a lot of papers on that. Then there's this paper is the only multi-model analysis that I'm aware of. So it's taking multiple YAMs and performs a set of analysis with these multiple YAMs. This is the typical way that Celine and others have already presented we have to work. So you see what's robust across models. And then possibly this is the latest paper I'm going to present that with a little more detail because it's the latest we have, but it's very simple. It's the first step. So tools, you can, I think the best paper always, you start from this, you have this, and then you play with the super complex model and you show some level of relationship between the two. That's And maybe they force you to put the toy analytical model in the supplementary information. It doesn't matter. You first understood that some dynamics were already there, and then you discover what more nuanced results your complex model gives you. If you can do that, remember that you have the toy analytical model out there, and it's called RISE. You can always play with that at the beginning. And then you can do anything that you want, but always remember, which is, you could think of, with all the new literature about damages, you can just flourish and take 100 different damage functions that are out there in the empirical work. And if you have a damage empirical friend, this is the moment you want to team up with that person, because that person is going to help you with all the data and the damage functions that you might play with. If you have your uncertainty friend, that's the time you team up, because there's, as I told you, there's a lot to play with. Stability concepts, you have these very few stability concepts that I talked about, and then you can play with these additional benefits and spillovers from coalition. And then you can look at what? You can look at the application of emissions of various coalitions. Mostly, you can look at which coalitions are stable, which are not. How does the largest effective coalition, because you might have the best coalition that you get is, Ghana plus Italy, and we do nothing with that. So you want to concentrate on effective coalition, potentially effective coalition that have some emissions in there. No? And then see what of this coalition, which ones of this coalition are stable. Now, this is a graph done, I guess, 15 years ago, and doesn't show any of the characteristics that Kai suggested, any. But at least I have the name of the group or region near the dot, so that helps in reading it. And so what you have here is simply an analysis which will never be published, which cost us, I don't know how many nights it was for the OECD. It's a report of the OECD, which will never be published, where we study all possible coalition, internally and externally stable, which means we had to do one-off. It took so much time of power, because 15 years ago, I mean, we did run in parallel, but it wasn't like you could do it on your laptop. And we do look at all the potentially effective coalition, and we find that the largest potentially internal stable coalition, so potentially internally stable, you have to enough welfare in the coalition to compensate the payoff of each country deviating. It's composed of all OECD countries, and you didn't do much with that. I mean, OECD countries together don't give you any kind of stabilization. And this is a graph that I find useful. It would be nice to see, at some point we wanted to see the free riding incentive. And this is the reaction to the GDP loss to a $100 tax in that region. And you see that basically most of what explains the free riding incentive, meaning the incentive to deviate, is in this case, how much GDP loss a tax imposes on that region. So if you test that region reaction to $100 tax, that's totally correlated with the free riding incentive. Now, I want to ask you to take your brain here, back from wherever it is, and ask yourself, what could change dramatically this picture? What is the basic assumption of this picture? Let's go back and think, how do you calculate free riding incentives? Free riding incentives is what you get if you're in the coalition versus what you get when you're outside the coalition. Okay. there's one element I never talked about yet, which is very relevant to what you get when you are in the coalition. Imagine we have a coalition of China, US, and Italy. Okay. How do you build the objective function of this coalition? How would you build? Yes.
I guess we assume equally shared benefits.
Okay. So he's proposing equally shared benefits. Are there other ways you can build a coalition of these three countries?
I think it's very similar to the European Union because they have it's like a big market of many countries. They have lots of obligations, but they also have the protection of each other's. And now with the Brexit, we see very clearly what happens when one unit goes out of the coalition.
Okay, so I wanted to take this, this is a good point. This could be captured in your model, but let's think of, you sit in front of the computer and you're writing the objective function of the coalition. One way is to say, well, you know, I split any benefit from being together, I split them equally. Are there other ways I can split the benefit from being together? I mean, Italy and US and China. So are there other ways you can split the benefits? Besides dividing the benefits in three parts. Per capita could be a way. Are there other ways? Think of a government with a welfare function aggregating across the utility of individuals. And think how, you know, you probably study, you know, how you can build a welfare function. There are many ways, other ways of building a welfare function, aggregating utility of individuals. One is
Valentina,
one individual, one vote. But then what other ways are there? Yes, I'm coming, Nico. So you could use ways that mimic the amount of poor people in their country that provide or give more weight, give greater share of the benefits of the coalition to the country with more poor people. Yes, Nico. Yes, here it's, so here I'm just, I mean, when you free ride, what happens is that the others keep doing the abatement. So unless you're a super big, an important country in terms of emissions, the effect on temperature will be negligible. So the most part of your free riding incentives will be driven by your ability or cost of mitigation if you're in. Exactly. But what I wanted to point out is that because here we're basically not, so you can make different assumptions on how much effort you have to take when you enter the coalition, depending on the weight we use to aggregate the coalition. So if we use a set of weights that gives, you know, that punishes the presence of very rich people, for example, then you would have a way of sharing the mitigation such that US pays much more than China, for example, which in turn pays. So you would have a different ranking on this dimension. This dimension reflects, so at the very basics where everybody comes in, Negishi weights, everybody is basically mitigating in a way that is consistent with their mitigation potential. Yes. Yeah. So if you want to, if you do that, then you're gonna have a very complex objective function, non-linear, but you can do that, or you can as I was saying, maybe take care of the poorer people. So you could say, okay, let's put weights in the objective function that aggregates the welfare of the various countries in the coalition in a way that gives more attention to the country with the most poor, with more poor people. So the exercise that I'm showing you here as the simplest possible set of weights, but when you play as exactly the same way when you play with your own region in a Nash game, that's what you do every day, or you're assuming no cooperation, you're making some assumption about the way you aggregate across time and across individuals if you have more than one representative individual. Similarly, when you do game theory, they don't tell you, but you still have to remember that the way you aggregate the countries within a coalition really tells a lot about the way you're thinking the redistribution of the benefit of being in a coalition should happen. And for you play with the, you can play with the simplest possible weights, but then you can get sophisticated. And you just have to be aware, like you should be aware of what is the pure rate of time preference of your model, or the inequality aversion that is implicit in your model. Similarly, you should think of the weights you're using to aggregate across coalitions. Okay, so the multimodal analysis done by Lessman and others was taken in a lot of models and was performing all the coalition analysis possible, and they came out with the following robust results. When abatement potential is low or marginal climate damages are high, you have the higher incentives for a region to stay in a coalition. So when they don't have to do much when they are in the coalition and they gain a lot from the coalition, then obviously they want to be in the coalition. In the absence of transfer, all models agree that stable coalition tend to be small and achieve little. So this was the same result that you had with theory model with all the asymmetry, the technical changes, nothing changes. So if you don't allow for transfers, now if you allow for transfers, and in particular transfer designed to minimize the free riding incentives. So within the coalition, you imagine that you take track of what would be the free riding incentive of that countries and you compensate that. You can have, you can obtain stable coalition that do at least half of what you can do with the Grand Coalition. Let me restate that. If with the Grand Coalition, you can basically bring down emissions substantially, no? Now, the Grand Coalition is never stable, almost never stable, never seen in any of these runs ever. But with the transfers that are designed to minimize the free riding incentives, you can get a coalition that does half of what the Grand Coalition can do. Still kind of shitty, but more than what you had here. And with this model, you can really look at the transfer and start to understand what they look like, do they make sense politically, etc. Okay. Oh, this, but it's okay. It's RISE 50. No, I don't do that otherwise. RISE 50 is the last paper I present to you. This is from Gazzotti and others. Emmerling, if I do some mistakes in presenting your model, you just correct me on the spot. So this is a RISE version with 50 regions. The abatement cost function is calibrated on NERC data polls for short terms and on IPCC model data for the long term. There is a climate module that matches MAGIC C and those scale calibrated on CMAP5. Then the damages are now here introduced as the Burke-Young model. I think that's there are various variation of the 6 variation that you can get from the empirical paper. And sorry about this, but so that then region maximize intertemporal welfare in a non-cooperative setting. So each country optimizes its mitigation strategy, taking other countries' behavior as a given. or in a corporate setting, imagine a global social planner that is forcing cooperation. They stop there at the paper, and they don't calculate whether we all know that the Grand Coalition is not stable, but then they don't do the next step, which would be to do all the coalitions. And that yellow should have been on the Burke and San Miguel, just to give you a sense of the fact that there's now so many damage functions that this is already outdated, and it's a 2021 paper. So it can be, there's so much things that you can do. And so what you see here are a few runs. The first run is, the first run that I want to show you is the non-cooperative, which is this one run. So here you have all countries taking into account damages, but they only can optimize their own emissions, and they only take into account their own damages. These other BAU runs are the BAU with the impacts, but there's no optimization. So you simply run the model, and countries can suffer climate change, but they like they do like this. They suffer climate change. They do nothing about it. They don't optimize basically, they're not allowed to optimize abatement. Oops. And this is the BAU without impacts. So BAU with impacts, without impacts, with impacts, but no optimization, NASH. And then there's the cooperative. And intriguingly, with this damage function, and there is some uncertainty due to the fact that you have various damage function, etc. But with this damage function, you go basically to 0 by the end of the century. And here is the effect in terms of temperature. These are emissions, and this is temperature. And you see that you stay below 2 degrees only. With the cooperative, you stay below 2 degrees almost always. Now, this paper has all the instruments, but that doesn't do the step that I'm trying to, I hope I convey the message should be done to calculate what are the incentives. So this is the optimal if I have a God that and she's enforcing the damages on other planets. She's enforcing the police on other planets, so that everybody hands in hand do this effort together. But that's not what happens in the reality. So what are the incentives for countries to be in this coalition, Grand Coalition, and what would be the the largest, most effective coalition that you can stabilize? This is what is still missing from this paper. So the message is, with the new damage function, nobody has done coalition analysis with the integrated assessment models. Am I right? Maybe you're thinking about that, but it hasn't happened yet. So when you want to do this in practice, what do you have to do? You have your model, which is typically, I imagine, solved, each region is solved independently. Or maybe you have a model that solves with a global planner. It depends, but you need to write a new piece of code that defines what level of aggregation, the coalition basically, and that you want to solve. So this is going to be something like hierarchically outside your model. You have your model, you have your solve, but hierarchically you want something that calls one region at a time or a group of regions together. Interaction on the regions, among the regions, depends on some global variable. In the simplest case, it depends on what? What is the simplest possible model of climate change? What is the variable that affects all countries? What is it that I do that affects every other country? What is the variable? You can say poo-poo and it's going to be fine. So you break the ice. Say poo-poo. What is it? The variable that affects every other country is in the model of climate change. Emissions. Okay. So it's going to be that the global emissions, the global emissions is the global variable, or temperature, if you want to think it in aggregated terms in time. Okay, that's going to affect. That's a global variable that I have to calculate outside each coalition, because it depends not only from the action of the coalition, but the action of other countries as well. Okay, so you'll have an area in your code that defines, you know, the level of aggregation you want. Say, I want the ground coalition minus US and the US, and I want to play this game. And each time there will be some information going from group ground coalition minus US to US when they solved. And this information is going to be what are the emissions the US is doing. This for the ground coalition minus US, vice versa. The US will need information about what emissions the others are doing to optimize. The stability of calculation, as I said, is then done ex post. You write, you save, or you write a piece of code that runs all the coalition. You go to bed, you wake up in the morning, you write a code that takes, you've saved all the payoffs of all the countries in all the different runs, and you calculate ex post all the coalitions that are stable and unstable in various different ways. And you can do the gamma core, you can do internally, externally, you can use a lot of, you can show off with a lot of different concepts of stability. And we do that with DICE Vanilla North-South, developed by Giacomo Marangoni for working purposes, for illustrative purposes alone. It's a very stupid, you know, it's DICE regionalized on 2 countries. And then you have a data regions that, you know, is your file with all the data for the region, the parameter, etc. And then you have these solve regions. And this is the piece of code that you want to, if you're interested and you want to do more of this, you want to look at. It's where, depending on, in the main file, we're going to write solve as a cooperative. And in the solve regions, then it's going to solve it as a cooperative. It's going to say, okay, solve the sum of, in this case, there's not many coalitions to study. Why? Because, I mean, how many coalitions can you have? You have 2 regions, you have either the Nash or the Grand Coalition. Okay, so in these solve regions, you're going to see the lines of code that either called by the non-cooperative command will solve one and the other, one and the other, one and the other until you, with iteration, you converge, or it will solve the sum of the welfare of both regions. So the case of the cooperative, the benevolent social planner is basically maximizing the utility of South and North. And then, as I said before, here there is a weight. I'm giving you, you can play with 2 population weighting scheme. With 2 weighting scheme. The first is the population weighting, and the second is the Negishi weighting. And if you want to go crazy about it, you can pick another set of weights and see what happens. The control variable always is emissions in North and emissions in South. But when you're solving North, and the iteration is solving North, it's getting the South emissions as a given, .L in GAMS who programs in L. So this is not optimized upon. It's coming from, it's a given, okay? And when it's solving South, it's taking as a given the emissions from the North, and it's optimizing the South. And then off you go, because the way DICE is solved is through iterations. No, you solve it until it converges. Oops. And the algorithm stops when the solution is not changing anymore. Whereas if you want to solve the non-cooperative, then it's going to maximize the utility, the welfare of the North, taking as given as the emissions of the other regions, etc. Sorry. So here, the control variable in the cooperative is emissions in both countries. Sorry, I was ahead of me, and I was talking about the non-cooperative. In the cooperative, obviously, the God is choosing emissions optimally in both North and South. In the non-cooperative, you do what I just said before, which is you take the emissions of the other regions and optimize depending on that. In both cases, you solve iterating until the game is solved. So I would like you to, we have 10 minutes.
Yes.
You didn't stop me.
We can go-
I told you to stop me after 1 hour. You didn't. No, but so no, let me conclude and then I'll show you the file and then you play with the file at home. So let's play, you play alone. Now, it's an interesting exercise and I'll show you in a second the code, but I want to leave you with this because this is the important message if you want to use that piece of code. And if you want to go already complex and run, with a more complex model, I can share the which part of the solve that basically does all the coalition. Obviously, the solve with the dice 2 regions. You only see the non-cooperative for 2 regions and the cooperative. So what is that you have to think about when you go home and do all the, the work that is needed for the nature climate change paper? First, you think about how you aggregate welfare within the coalition. So how much transfer of wealth is allowed and what is the ethical basis of this transfer? You want to think about that. That's a very interesting part of your story. Then you want to think about which coalition makes sense to explore. Only the, potentially effective or politically meaningful coalition, not everything else. So there's no need for you to use that parallel computing like crazy, just to trim it down to a set of coalitions that make sense. Don't use energy for nothing. Cooperation on what? Cooperation on what? On emissions, on technologies, on do they have a treaty on trade? That's important that you, depending on how your countries are related in your model, that's going to be very important. Are the spillover from cooperation appropriated or not? So is the cost of a technology, for example, in a country that is mitigating the cost of that in that country alone, or is that cost of the technology a global cost? So if the first case, then there's no spillover. The good fact of mitigation, that is to lower the cost of technology, is not shared with the fringe. Else you can then experiment to share that cost and see what happens. And there are papers, theory papers that have explored that. Then how do you compute stability? Internal, external, potential, core stability. As I said, you can have fun with all this concept and include all that in the supplementary information and use in the main paper possibly the internal, external stability, which is the most used. Should I include other elements besides consumption in the objective that each country region is maximizing? What is the payoff? Is the payoff only my happiness, my welfare, or Nico's payoff is a very complicated nonlinear payoff where there is also the other country's happiness? Good luck with solving that, but it's an idea. And so this is where I leave you. Game theory can provide, I think, insights for understanding the dynamics of climate change negotiation. If you think that a paper on climate collapse has produced the most important and relevant environmental policy that we are passing next year in Europe, you may think that people are crazy, but you may also think that game theory is relevant. I mean, it's a climate club paper that started the narration, the story of the idea of something that maybe is completely crazy because CBAM may be completely crazy, but it is an idea that started from this literature. So it can be influential. I think that the most fun part that I think I will work on in the future is to play the political economy within a region where players are not, you're not playing Russia versus US, but you're playing the government versus the concerned young citizens versus the lobby of the fossil fuel. And I think that's the most, but the structure is the same. You just downscale it to the country level. And the other thing that I already alluded to is this extension to these new technologies that were not explored. With that said, I will open this. So you have a code folder in the share folder in Dropbox.
This model is written in GAMS, and I think we sent you also this license, which should be
Okay.
valid for 1 year, right?
Così.
Where you can try
Okay.
out the models in GAMS.
No? Yes?
Yeah,
No?
please let, you have to send an email. I think, I don't know how many of you did,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it's a good opportunity to try to
Okay,
write this
but
model.
we're not sharing anymore. It's just, so
And-
here it doesn't even open the GAMS, but it's
Yeah.
okay. It's just, you know, you're gonna find something like that. That's what you open. The file is called DICE, Vanilla, North South, or any version of that. And the first experiment that you can run is to run the thing, and you can run it in 2 ways. Now, to look at here, there's the possibility of running in non-cooperative mode or in cooperative mode. This is the first thing. And then if you are a modeler, you trace back what that changes. Okay, and you discover what happens when you move from non-cooperative to cooperative. I don't want you to look at the results. This is a DICE 2013 damage function, so forget about the results. But I wanted to look what happens when you move to COP to from non-COP to COP, and then how the weights are generated. So here are the Nagase weights, and you can set population weights or Nagase weights. So these are the 2 things. Now the weights will matter if you are in the cooperative setting, will not matter if you're in the non-cooperative setting, obviously. But that's the 2 things that I wanted to look at if you open this code. And the second part is the GAMS file called solve model. And there you see the action of moving from NASH to, to COP to non-COP or COP to NASH. Okay. So this is it. So if you have any question, if you want the version that we use with which, you just have to ask to me.
Thanks a lot, Valentina.
Devi chiamarmi, you could have called me.
Yes, no, timing is good, I think. I mean, this really, yeah, the best is to try it out yourself now in the afternoon, maybe in the group project.
Yes, if you want to do it.
So there is this GAMS license. I mean, if you have questions, let us know. I mean, in theory, it should be working, and it's valid for 1 year, so you can have 1 year to write your Nature Climate paper, as you were saying. There's also in the handbook at the very end, I think we put together a couple of links of IEMs, several of which are written in GAMS. So in theory, you can, which are open sourcely available, including Nico's Remind model. But also the RISE 50 and some others. Also, Message has an open. So you can go to these repositories, download them. I don't know about Mimosa, but it's in Python. So also that. Anyway, so there are a lot of them. So feel free to try them out. And yeah, I think it's also. I mean, the idea of this school is to kind of break this barrier by going into IEM. So feel free to do that and reach out to any of the modelers also here. And see if it works, including starting from DICE or North-South DICE and further. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Can I just say,
Sure.
don't start from Mind, do start from DICE. Sorry, but it's the only way you can wrap your head around what's in the model, and then you move forward. If you start from which, I'm just talking about our baby. It's too overwhelming. You have to start from DICE, I think. Sorry.
Yes, good point.
Let's go and have a coffee.
Any other questions further?
I'm
Okay.
here today, tomorrow, so you come.
Great. So we will reconvene at 11 for the talk by Sarita, who just arrived. So please, be in time. 11 back here, and coffee should be served outside. And hopefully it's not raining, so we can also go into the park.
But
Okay, thanks again, and see you in 25 minutes.